In this next module, I'm going to talk about the issues of ghostwriting and guest authorship. So this has been a hot topic in the last 3-4 years. It's been covered in a number of articles in the New York Times, and it has had some pretty profound influence on the medical literature. So I want to spend some time talking about it. I'm mostly going to be talking about the medical literature here. This has been a major problem in the medical literature. I'm not sure of the extent to which it occurs in other scientific disciplines, but certainly for the medical literature, it's been a huge issue of late. So what are we talking about here? So what are ghost authors? So a ghost author is somebody that a company would hire, a professional writer who a company would hire to draft a manuscript. At the end of the day, though, they would not be listed as an author on the manuscript, hence the term ghost authorship. So the company goes out and hires somebody, and it's, I'm certainly have nothing against professional writers getting involved in the manuscript writing process. I think that can often be a very good thing. The problem is in the lack of transparency, that the person drafting the manuscript is paid by a drug company, is probably given the message that they're supposed to be putting across by the drug company, and yet there's no transparency on that on the final draft. It comes across oftentimes, some of these articles are then given a guest or honorary authorship, which I'll talk about in a minute, to make it look like an academic wrote that. And so there's all sorts of problems there. The related type of authorship is this guest authorship, or sometimes called an honorary author. And this happens when a company writes a manuscript, drafts a manuscript, does all the data analysis, kind of makes all the conclusions on their own. After the draft is ready, they contact somebody who's at an academic institution, usually kind of a prestigious university, and say, hey, we'd love to make you an author on this paper. You remember you kind of helped us a little bit with the study design way back when. Well, now we want to make you first author on the paper. And this happens, and I'm going to show you how well documented this is. And authors, academic researchers lend their name as an author, often a first author. And it's a benefit for sort of a tit-for-tat relationship. So it's a benefit for the academic researcher, because oftentimes these drug company studies are major clinical trials that get published in major journals, so they boost the academic researcher's academic resume for things like promotion. They also help the drug company, because if you kind of try to minimize the involvement of the drug company and make it look like somebody at a prestigious independent academic institution was the person responsible for the article, that bolsters some credibility to the paper, some sense of that there's an independent person involved. So obviously that is misleading. So people have tried to figure out how often does this occur. It's kind of a well-known thing that this has occurred for a long time in the medical literature. People have been aware of it, and it's just kind of been done. It's been getting a lot more press attention lately because of the fact that there's been some major drug trials, some court trials involving drug companies, where there's been a lot of internal documents that have been opened for viewing because of these court trials, and some interesting things have been found there, and so I think there's just a heightened awareness of this issue. So how often does it occur? In the latest study in British Medical Journal in 2011, some researchers sent an anonymous survey to the corresponding authors of articles from top medical journals. So these are things like the Annals of Internal Medicine, JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, and they asked them to report in an anonymous survey how often guest or honorary authorship occurred and how often ghostwriting occurred. And so they found that 17.6% of those corresponding authors reported the occurrence of honorary or guest authorship, and 7.6% reported the occurrence of ghost authors. So it's happening, and some of these papers, of course, may have overlapped. So it's happening, though, in about somewhere around 20% or so of papers. So that's a fairly high percentage, and these, again, are the top medical journals. So this really quite pervasive. So just to give you an example of this, as a case study, there was a paper published in JAMA in 2008. the researchers had access to a whole bunch of internal company documents from Merck, because Merck was being sued due to the drug Vioxx, which was pulled off shelves when it was learned to increase the risk of heart attack. So the researchers went through a whole bunch of court documents. They found about 250 court documents that were relevant to this issue of authorship. And they looked at these company emails and company internal documents that were related to either publishing clinical trials papers or review papers. And what they found was really quite interesting and shocking. So I'm just going to quote the summary that the authors wrote in the JAMA paper. So they reviewed 24 clinical trials papers, and they said this is what they found. Documents were found describing Merck employees working either independently or in collaboration with medical publishing companies to prepare manuscripts and subsequently recruiting external academically affiliated investigators to be authors. So this is this whole problem of using honorary or guest authors. Recruited authors were frequently placed in the first and second positions of the authorship list. So again, people really knew that this was occurring, but when we had all of these documents, then you could really kind of track exactly how prevalent and how systematic this was at a company like Merck. And just to give you an idea, this is one of the emails that was published in this article. It's from an internal company email where they're writing to a potential guest author and asking them if they'd like to be an author. And it kind of just shows you how blatant this is. So the company writes to the potential guest author, "I would like to invite you to be an author on the abstract and manuscript for this study. We are currently preparing both for submission before the end of this year." So obviously the company is already preparing these things, and now after the fact, they're asking for this person to be an author in the study. "Could you please let me know if you would be interested in authorship on both the abstract and manuscript, one of the two planned publications, or none?" So it's like, well, authorship is just this, thing that the company has to give out, and the researcher can choose whether or not they want to be an author on any of these things. So you can see really that this is truly guest authorship. "In making your decision, you may want to take into consideration that the results of this study were negative at first glance." So they're saying, hey, to the researcher, you may not want to be on this study because it came out negative. Well, obviously that's not the reason somebody should be an author on a study or not. Obviously this researcher was not heavily involved in the analysis and the writing of this paper, so this is a clear case of guest authorship, and they turned up a number of very emails like this, which made it very obvious what was going on. Even more interesting when they looked at the review papers. Now, review papers aren't based on any new data. So what was happening with the review papers is that people that were in marketing in Merck were kind of coming up with a marketing strategy. They were then contracting with medical publishing companies who would ghostwrite the manuscripts. So obviously those publishing companies, those professional writers, weren't going to be put as the authors on that manuscript. And then they would go to an external academic person and ask them to be the author. So this is a real case where a review article may present a particular opinion or view or perspective, and so they're basically getting an outside academic person who has this sense of authority and independence to lend their name to their marketing strategy. And often these authors were paid honoraria for their participation. So not only did they not write the article and they get to put it on their CV, but they're also being paid to lend their name. And interestingly, only half of these review articles disclose the ties to Merck. So that's quite insidious, and you can see that could have a profound impact on the medical literature. Merck could actually put this whole set of opinions and perspectives out in the medical literature with it having the stamp of it coming from an academic institution when it really came from the drug company marketing people. So you can see why this has been such a hot issue. I'll refer you to a couple more articles if you're curious. It's a very fascinating topic. If you're curious to read more, there's been a whole bunch of articles in the New York Times about this, and I'll just quote you from one of these articles to again show this wasn't just Merck. So in another case with Wyeth being sued over hormone replacement therapy, another whole set of court documents came out. And so the New York Times and PLOS Medicine got together and kind of went through these documents, and here's the summary. The court documents provide a detailed paper trail showing how Wyeth contracted with a medical communications company to outline articles, draft them, and then solicit top physicians to sign their names, even though many of the doctors contributed little or no writing. The documents suggest that the practice went well beyond the case of Wyeth and hormone therapy, involving numerous drugs from other pharmaceutical companies. So this was a really widespread thing for drug companies. And again, now journal editors are becoming much more aware of it. So it's likely that this practice will change, but as that British Medical Journal article showed, it's still fairly pervasive in the literature, at least in the medical literature.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.